Charles and Carol Stuart were living the American dream. Young, successful in love, and expecting their first baby, the Stuarts epitomized glittering, aspirational perfection. Until one October night, when a single bullet ripped through their marriage and in the process brought a city to its knees. Hello, and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week, I'm putting a spotlight on the case of the sweet wife and her loving husband. When you looked at Charles and Carol Stuart, the first word that came to mind was wow. This was a couple who had it all. Carol was a whip-smart, raven-haired, dark-eyed beauty, while Charles, also known as Chuck, was a savvy go-getter who personified tall, dark, and handsome. Carol DeMady was a native of Medford, Massachusetts, a working-class town northwest of Boston, and she grew up in a traditional Italian family and had dreams of becoming a lawyer. Irish Catholic Charles also had blue-collar roots, his own sights set on owning a restaurant one day. He grew up in the suburb of Revere, known for Kelly's roast beef and Wonderland Greyhound Park. He was the oldest of four boys and was described as the man of the house. Carol's friends and family say she was an excellent student, and she attended Boston College, graduating in 1981, and later attended Suffolk University Law School, also in Boston, receiving her degree in 1986. During her summers off from school, Carol worked. And in the summer of 1980, while toiling as a waitress at the Driftwood restaurant in Revere, about a 10-minute drive from her own home in Medford, she met Charles Stuart. Charles was a cook at the restaurant, and according to the New York Times, his love for the culinary arts was born during his time as a student at Northeast Metropolitan Regional Vocational High School, also known as the VOC, in Wakefield, Massachusetts. Students alternate learning trades like car repair and plumbing with traditional academic courses such as math and English. Charles excelled at the culinary curriculum, so much so that by the time he was a sophomore, he was running the school's restaurant, the Breakheart Inn. Upon graduating from high school, Charles had told friends that he attended Brown University on a football scholarship, but was forced to quit due to a knee injury, but that he eventually graduated from Salem State College in Salem, Massachusetts. An employee who worked at the Driftwood at the time said that the ladies loved Charles, but he only had eyes for Carol. And according to friends, Charles would flirt with her by writing her cute little messages on the order tickets that she would send back from the tables that she would wait on. It was an endearing move, and it totally made him stand out to Carol. That is kind of cute when you think about it. Carol was dating another boy who was Italian-American like her, which was what her father, Gus, who also tended bar at the restaurant, wanted for her. But Charles swept Carol off her feet, so that other guy just didn't stand a chance. Carol was warm, open, outgoing, friendly, and funny, like Lucille Ball funny, according to her friend Reverend Barbara Williamson. Bit of a chatty Cathy. The perfect complement to Charles's more quiet, reserved nature, or what some friends described as someone who was a little hard to know. What seemed important to Carol and Charles was that they understood each other's ambition. They both wanted that brass ring, that upscale lifestyle that neither of them had while they were growing up. They wanted it all. Charles Stuart and Carol DeMady decided to pursue their dreams together, and in 1985, they got married. By the late 80s, the Stuarts had definitely grabbed that brass ring. Carol realized her dream of becoming an attorney, working in-house as one for a legendary local publishing company, Connors Publishing, in West Newton. Charles, meanwhile, had turned in his spatula in favor of a sales job at the swanky furrier Cakis & Sons on the exclusive Newbury Street. So when you think of Newbury Street in Boston, it's kind of like Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills or Michigan Avenue in Chicago, just a lot of very upscale, high-end stores. And Charles was able to work his way up from sales associate to general manager, so he's running the whole show over there. And due to his sales savvy, Charles was pulling in a six-figure income. He wore expensive suits, drove a nice car, and to complete the picture, he and Carol had bought a home in the town of Reading, which is a suburb of Boston. Their slate blue house had a jacuzzi and a pool, and was the site of many pool parties for friends and family. Charles even had that oh-so-hard-to-attain gadget known as a cell phone. And it's hard to imagine now when cell phones are a dime a dozen, but back then it was a real status symbol to have one. Only those with a lot of zeros in their bank accounts were carrying around a cell phone. Granted, it was the size of a brick, but you had a cell phone. That was the most important thing. In 80s parlance, they were yuppies, also known as young urban professionals. Everyone wanted to be a yuppie in the 80s because that meant you'd made it. To be a yuppie, you were usually college educated, likely the first in your family. You had a high-profile career, so typically that meant a doctor or a lawyer or something in business or finance, whatever it was something that made you a lot of money. You could buy the BMW, which was the preferred automobile of yuppies, eat at the best restaurants. You could buy that nice house or luxury condo. You went on the best vacations. You bought the designer labels. Because in the 1980s, being a yuppie was the greatest status symbol there was. Charles and Carol's neighbors described a sweet, loving couple who seemed devoted to each other. According to the New York Times, the couple liked to garden and often went jogging together around the neighborhood. Charles was that guy that would help you shovel the snow from your driveway in the winter. He coached the local Little League team, and one friend even described them as Ken and Barbie. As their across-the-street neighbor, Lena Guarino told the New York Times, they had everything. And as if their lives weren't perfect enough to sweeten the pot, Carol was expecting their first child, a little boy. Could life have been any better for the Stuarts? October 23rd, 1989. Carol was 7 months pregnant, and she's excited about the baby. Although the couple lives in the suburbs, Carol is receiving her prenatal care at Brigham and Women's Hospital in the city, which is a premier hospital for expectant mothers. This top-ranked hospital was located on the fringe of the predominantly Black and Latino neighborhood known as Mission Hill. If you wanted to go to Brigham and Women's Hospital, which, because it was the best in the city, so of course you wanted to go there, you pretty much had to go through Mission Hill. There was really not any way around that. In the late 80s, Mission Hill was not known to be a great neighborhood. There were gangs, there were drugs, violence was a way of life. As former police chief from Boston, Francis Mickey Roach, told City Confidential, after spending a week in Mission Hill, a newly minted officer would come out as a seasoned vet, so it was really kind of hardened you pretty quick. It really was the kind of place that you wouldn't want to be after the sun went down. Least of all if you were a white couple from the suburbs. It's 8:47 p.m. On this particular night, Charles and Carol have just attended a Lamaze class at the hospital. They're in their car, a Toyota Cressida, stopped at a stoplight. Out of nowhere, a black man dressed in a black jogging suit with red stripes flings open the back door and jumps into the back seat of Charles and Carol's car. He's got a gun, and he's demanding cash and Carol's jewelry. There are threats, screams, pandemonium. In the midst of the chaos, the assailant sees Charles's cell phone and he panics. Whose car has he jumped into? Because again, nobody has cell phones back then except for rich people and cops. He determines that Charles and Carol are undercover cops, yelling out 5-0 before he shoots them. Carol is shot in the head. Charles is shot in the back. The man flees, taking off with the cash and jewelry. Miraculously, Charles is able to dial 911 from that cell phone and utter the words, "My wife's been shot, I've been shot." A disoriented Charles has no idea where he is. He can't give them a cross street. There's no GPS on his phone, no cell phone towers, no cameras, no ability whatsoever to track their location. It's a mad, frenzied dash to find the Stuarts. The 911 dispatcher is able to garner enough details from Charles to enable cops and EMTs to literally just start driving around the area searching for them. Fortunately, they're found, but it's horrific. Blood everywhere. A shell-shocked, barely coherent husband. A pregnant wife with a bullet in her skull, fighting not only for her life, but the life of her unborn baby. Charles is taken to Boston City Hospital, while Carol is rushed back to Brigham and Women's Hospital, where literally moments before she was taking Lamaze classes in anticipation of giving birth in a few months. As you can imagine, this story just exploded, not only in Boston, but around the country. People are transfixed by this horror show. The gruesome photo of this couple gunned down in their car is on the front page of every newspaper, every magazine, the lead story on every newscast. And if there had been social media back then, it would have trended for days. I mean, it probably would have broken social media, to be honest. Back in Boston, it inflamed the city. What had Boston come to if a young, attractive, affluent couple from the suburbs, expecting a baby, couldn't do something as simple and joyous as go to a Lamaze class without being gunned down? To make matters worse, this thug was on the loose. Why hadn't cops caught him? Why was this mysterious black man still roaming the streets of the city? Didn't Boston have enough to contend with all the crime and gangs and the simmering racial tensions tearing at the fabric of the city? Wasn't enough enough? So let's pause for a moment and talk about the city of Boston. When we think of Boston, we think of the historic Boston Marathon, the Italian restaurants tucked into the North End, Mike's Pastry, which I can tell you the lines that snake around Mike's Pastry are totally worth standing in because it is good. The make way for the duckling statues in the public garden, Fenway Park, Ivy League University's Faneuil Hall, Cheers. Yeah, I said it, Cheers. You know, if you went to Boston, you'd go. Boston is also a highly segregated city, breaking down not just along racial lines, but by ethnicity as well. You were deeply defined by what neighborhood you were from, and it was rare, really, to stray from that. Where you grew up was where you would end up. So if you grew up in Charlestown or South Boston, you were probably going to buy a house near your parents' house and raise your family in Charlestown or South Boston or Somerville or Chelsea or wherever you grew up. Integration was considered a dirty word. It was, to paraphrase from West Side Story, you stayed with your own kind of people. So in an attempt to desegregate the city, the state's legislature passed the Racial Imbalance Act of 1965, which essentially ordered Boston school districts to take kids from different neighborhoods and bus them into a school district that wasn't their own. So you could be a kid from Dorchester or Roxbury, and on Monday you're going to school in Dorchester or Roxbury. But on Tuesday, you're being put on a bus to go to school in Rosendale or Hyde Park. As you can imagine, this did not go well. This forced busing policy led to violent protests, sit-ins, mock funerals, stabbings, multiple riots, black and white students using separate entrances at the schools, and many students just not even bothering to show up for school at all. White flight to the suburbs ensued, and enrollment at Boston schools plummeted from 100,000 to 57,000, with about 15% of those being white students. The controversial policy finally came to an end in 1988 and somehow was declared a victory. Tackle that another time for another day. But all of this is barely concealed beneath the Band-Aid in 1989, and it is against this backdrop that the attack on Charles and Carol takes place. The assault on them just rips the bandage off the wound, leaving it to bleed and fester as this unsolved case dragged on with no arrests. And the thing is, this just couldn't happen. The city is about to blow. The case could not grow cold. This case could not go unsolved. Police had to arrest someone. Except they had very little to go on. The crime scene, which was Charles and Carol's car, was a no-go because EMTs had been working to save their life. There are countless fingerprints. Everything's been disturbed, so forget trying to get a suspect out of that. And remember, there's no surveillance cameras, so the physical evidence for this case was pretty much nothing, null and void. From his hospital bed at Boston City Hospital, Charles repeats the story about this burglary gone wrong. Considering the trauma that he and Carol have suffered, his calm demeanor and near flawless recall of the events amazes friends and family, right down to his description of the jogging suit the assailant wore and the way the man looked at him after reaching inside the jacket of that jogging suit for his gun. Meanwhile, Carol's baby was delivered by C-section. Christopher Stuart was born with brain damage, and doctors wanted to hang on to see if his condition would improve. Carol would not make it. She dies from the wounds that she sustained during the attack. She was 30 years old. Her memorial service, held at St. James Church, the very same church where she and Charles were married in 1985, was standing room only, crammed with family, friends, loved ones, the community. Among the dignitaries that were in attendance were the Mayor of Boston, Ray Flynn, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis, and Cardinal Bernard Law. Charles's brothers served as pallbearers at the service, and Charles himself was unable to attend the service because he was still in the hospital recovering from his own wounds. However, he composed a moving tribute to his slain wife, asking a friend to read it during the service, saying in part, "Good night, sweet wife, my love. God has called you to his hands. I miss you and I love you. Your husband, Chuck." He further urged compassion and forgiveness for Carol's killer, writing, "In our souls, we must forgive this sinner because he would too." I mean, this just leaves you in a puddle on the floor. It's beautiful, it's simple, completely heartbreaking. As you can imagine, the funeral, it just whips everyone up in a frenzy all over again. People are terrified. They're thinking, could I be next? What's to stop this from happening again? Is it safe to walk down the street, stop at a stoplight, be out after dark anywhere in the city? People are even demanding that the death penalty be brought back. So the heat and the pressure is on to make an arrest. So with tensions about to erupt, the hunt for a suspect intensifies. In an effort to ramp up the search and produce a suspect, Boston police employed a policy known as stop and frisk, which is something we've heard a lot about over the past few years, particularly its use in New York City. The policy was meant to, in theory, curb the many shootings and rampant drug dealing that was happening in Boston at the time. Except the execution of it pretty much sucked. It was aimed pretty squarely at Black and brown residents of the city, and the only cause necessary to stop and frisk was literally if the cops thought you looked suspicious. That was it. No probable cause, no circumstantial evidence, just, I don't like the way you look, so I'm going to stop you, frisk you, rough you up. That might be all they would do if you were lucky, because it could have been a lot worse. So literally it could have been, I don't like the way you're chewing your gum. I don't like that you're chewing gum. I don't like that the gum you're chewing is pink. That's literally all the justification that the police would need to stop and frisk. And the police in this instance were just straight up harassing Black people. Doors were kicked in, homes destroyed, folks were being strip searched. As Leslie E. Harris, former public defendant, told the 1980s, the deadliest decade, quote, "Police went on a rampage with the blessings of the mayor, the police chief, and the city. There were 150 stop and frisks made all day, all night, every day, every night. It was a relentless assault on Black men." And what did police get for all of this? Well, nothing. Not a single suspect, not a single arrest. Meanwhile, Charles and Carol's son, Christopher William Stuart, who was born brain dead, has no hope. Charles makes the decision to take the baby off life support. Christopher was 17 days old. Just like Carol's funeral, little Christopher's death riles people up all over again, and they are demanding that police find the guy, find this guy. Except police keep coming up empty. And just when it seems that they aren't going to crack this case, they get a break. So there's this kid who lives in Mission Hill, which, remember, is the bad neighborhood where Charles and Carol were attacked. This kid is bragging to his friends that it was his uncle. This kid says that his uncle showed him a gun and that this was the gun used to shoot the lady. His uncle has a rep for being a bad dude, a really long rap sheet, in and out of jail, so it seems plausible that he could have done it. So now the cops have a name, and that's all they need. They rampage through Mission Hill looking for a man by the name of William Bennett. Helicopters flood the sky. Cops litter the rooftops of the buildings. They batter ram their way into this man's house, searching for Carol's jewelry, for the gun used in the attack, the tracksuit that Charles said the assailant wore. And they just decimate the place. Holes in the walls, furniture slashed open, flooring pulled up, and they found nothing. Not one single thing to tie William Bennett to this crime. The cops aren't giving up, though. They go ahead and they arrest him on some other charges so that they can bring him in and question him about the case. So William Bennett says, hey, it wasn't me. But cops do a photo lineup with Charles, who was still in the hospital, and he picks William Bennett's photo out of that lineup. And there's the nephew, who still says, yeah, that's what my uncle told me, that he did it. So police arrest William Bennett for the murders of Carol and Christopher. 6 weeks after teetering on a knife's edge of anxiety and fear, the city collectively exhales. The bad guys behind bars, Christopher and Carol, will get their justice, and life can go back to some form of normal. Except, there's someone out there who knows that this is all completely bogus. Someone who knows what really happened that night. Someone who knows that there was no burglary gone wrong. Who knows William Bennett did not murder Carol and Christopher. Someone who knows the truth. Charles's little brother Matthew has a story of his own to tell. And when it's revealed, it will rock Boston and indeed the country to the core. 4 months after the murder, Charles told Matthew that he was ready to pursue his lifelong dream of owning a shishi restaurant in downtown Boston. In fact, he was so serious, as the New York Times noted, he even took a course at the local learning annex on how to buy and operate a restaurant. He had an opportunity with a friend of his, but he needed a hefty chunk of cash in order to invest. He complained to his brother that having a baby was going to put a serious crimp in his plans, starting with his and Carol's hefty 6-figure income, because she likely wouldn't go back to work after having the baby, which would make Charles the sole breadwinner. The New York Times reported in 1990 that Charles made these same complaints to his friend David F. McLean, who also said Charles told him he was mad because Carol had refused to get an abortion. McLean said Charles had also whined that he had begun to notice that pregnant Carol had, quote, the upper hand in their marriage. So to solve his problem, well, McLean claims Charles asked him for help killing Carol. Can you imagine you're having lunch or dinner with a friend of yours and they say, hey, will you help me kill my wife? I mean, that's just bananas. Fortunately for his friend, his friend didn't take the bait. And maybe he didn't think Charles was serious, or maybe Charles laughed off the whole thing, but Charles was dead serious. No one is really sure how he came up with the idea to perpetrate this whole black gunman ruse. An employee at Cacus, Peter Jarowski, told the New York Times in 1990 that he and Charles had talked about some gang-related shootings that had taken place in the city's bad neighborhoods. So maybe a light bulb went off over his head and he thought, oh, this will be a simple little thing, and not realizing just how out of control the whole thing would become. There were some locals that pointed to Charles's upbringing in the blue-collar Revere, a town where there were no black residents. And as I said earlier, the attitude in Boston was really that you stick with your own. At any rate, Charles cooked up a plan to execute Carol and the baby, then cash in on a life insurance policy in Carol's name where he was the beneficiary, which was reported to be about $82,000. He'd take the money, invest in his restaurant, start a brand new life, no wife, no kid. What could be simpler? indeed. So again, Matthew is the baby of the family and described as the runt of the litter. And he adored and idolized his big brother Charles, who was successful and well off. Not at all like Matthew, who had no job, no real prospects. And Charles was able to use that adoration in order to lure his starry-eyed brother into being a part of his plan. Not wanting to disappoint his big brother, Matthew agreed to help Charles with whatever he needed. Charles had instructed Matthew to meet him on the night of October 23rd because he's going to hand him a Gucci bag with some things inside. He doesn't tell Matthew what will be in this bag or why he wants to meet him, but Matthew, ever the devoted brother, he doesn't ask questions, he just does what he's told. That night, Charles does come to a stop at an intersection after having taken a detour on the way home. But the person who shot Charles and Carol that night wasn't some random black guy in a jogging suit with red stripes. It was Charles. He shoots Carol in the head. He takes her wedding and engagement rings from her fingers, her other jewelry, and then he shoots himself. He puts Carol's jewelry and the gun in this bag, and when Matthew shows up, he hands it over. Matthew's role is that he is supposed to get rid of this bag wholesale. Except Matthew opens up the bag. He sees the gun, he sees the jewelry, but he doesn't really understand what's going on. He tosses the gun into the Pines River in Revere, but something compels him to hang on to that engagement ring. And then when the news of the brutal attack hits the media, Matthew has the sickening realization that his brother has murdered his wife. And as the news explodes across the city, as the headlines across the country ignite, as Boston police tear through Mission Hill in the frantic search for this boogeyman who murdered an innocent woman and her unborn baby, Matthew can no longer stay silent about what he knows. Just as William Bennett is about to be indicted for the murders of Carol and Christopher, Matthew comes forward and points the finger at his brother. He tells police where to find the gun, and having Carol's engagement ring bolsters his claim. And when the news hits the media that it was Charles who murdered his wife and son, people are, of course, stunned, outraged, because how could this have happened? How could this handsome, successful, devoted husband who wrote flirty notes to Carol on the bottom of her food orders when he was courting her, whose distressed 911 call revealed a horror that none of us could fathom, who wrote those heartfelt words in tribute to his sweet wife, how could he do this? Because much like Chris Watts, Josh Powell, and other men who annihilate their families, divorce wasn't an acceptable solution for Charles. In his mind, the absolute only way out of his quote-unquote predicament was to murder his wife and unborn child. And there was also perhaps another reason, aside from the yearning to open a restaurant, that Charles was so eager to get rid of Carol. As the New York Times reported, Charles had struck up a friendship, let's say, with 22-year-old Deborah Allen, described by the paper as strikingly attractive. She was a sales associate at Cacus Furs with Charles, and a graduate of Brown University. She and Charles had gone out for meals together, and he'd even bought her a sweatshirt and some sneakers as a gift. The Stuart's neighbor, Maureen Vodchik, told the Times that Carol had complained to her that Charles was going out alone on Friday nights and staying out late, and it's pretty safe to assume he was probably with Deborah Allen on those nights. After Charles was shot, Deborah Allen made calls to him while he was in the hospital, but she claims it was only because he asked her to. And all the calls were paid for on his credit card. That's what you did back in the day. You would put calls on credit cards, or you actually had a calling card. Fun times. According to her, to Deborah Allen, after Charles was released from the hospital, he indicated he wanted more from their relationship. And it was at that point, she says, that she broke things off. And after he was released from the hospital, he went on a little bit of a shopping spree. He bought a pair of diamond earrings and a gold brooch, presumably for this same Deborah Allen, but she says that she never received any gifts of jewelry from him. In Charles's mind, there weren't any cons, only pros to his plan to murder Carol. And it turns out it wasn't just Matthew who knew about Charles's plan, and I'll note here that Matthew thought this was an insurance scam that he was helping out with, not murder. And Charles had in fact offered him $10,000 for his participation in this scheme. There were also reports of an abandoned fake burglary at Charles and Carol's house, as though they were going to make it look as though, or Charles was going to try to make it look as though Carol was murdered during a break-in gone wrong. Apparently, Charles had talked to friends and family all the time about wanting Carol dead, and his other brothers, the same ones who were pallbearers at Carol's funeral, they were also privy to Charles's plan, although there is some question as to who knew what when. There were 2 older half-sisters, another brother, and Charles's parents, and they were all said to have known in early January that Charles had killed Carol, and no one said a word. This is just bizarre. What were they thinking? Well, here's maybe a possible line into what they were thinking. Charles's brother Michael, who was a firefighter at the time, he says his brother asked for his help in the weeks before the murder, but he refused. He later admitted that 3 days after the murders, little brother Matthew fessed up to him about the whole scheme. Except instead of encouraging Matthew to tell the police what he knew, Michael told the Boston Herald in 2011 that he thought it would be better for Matthew to secretly extract a taped confession from Charles while he was still in the hospital. I mean, this is like cuckoo clock logic to me, but he says that was his plan. So, not sure if anyone ever attempted to set up this Hill Street Blues sting operation or not, but I'll just leave it out there. This is what the brother, Michael, claims he wanted, what he thought was a good way to go about this, but all right, okay, whatever. Now, Carol's brother, Carl, he doesn't buy this logic either. And he told local TV station WLVI about the Stuart siblings, quote, "Can you believe that they came over to our house to comfort my parents? It is just mind-boggling that they would sit with us or allow us to visit Chuck, to cry over him and pray for his recovery, knowing that Chuck was responsible for what happened to Carol." Amen. Lying or covering up things, pretending, was perhaps something Charles came by honestly, pun kind of sort of intended there. Remember how Charles had told friends that he'd lost his football scholarship to Brown University because of a knee injury? How he'd later graduated from Salem State College? Well, Brown University told the New York Times that Charles hadn't ever even applied to the school, while Salem State said Charles had been enrolled in 1979, but after 2 months had dropped out. Charles had played basketball and baseball, not football, but according to his coaches and what they told the New York Times, he was, quote, an average fielder and a poor hitter when it came to baseball, and a good shooter but slow at hoops. To his credit, Matthew was tired of the lies and he came clean. And now police, armed with a warrant for his arrest, are on the hunt for Charles, the tragic survivor of a horrific and unfathomable attack. Except Charles, who has cashed in one insurance policy already and, according to the New York Times, had reportedly applied to cash yet another policy worth $100,000, is nowhere to be found. January 3rd, 1990. A Sheraton hotel in Braintree, Massachusetts, about 20 minutes outside of Boston. Charles Stuart gets up at 4:30 a.m., having put in a request for a wake-up call the night before. He drives his brand-new Nissan Maxima, purchased with the money from Carol's insurance policy just 2 days prior, into Boston toward the Tobin Bridge. He parks at the bottom and cuts on the hazard lights. On the passenger seat beside him is a note that says he could not bear the charges against him. He gets out of the car. He jumps 145 feet into the icy waters of the Mystic River below. His body was recovered the next day, and he was later buried in an unmarked grave. He was 30 years old. So this is a stunning turn, but it wasn't quite the end. In 1992, Matthew Stuart was sentenced to 3 to 5 years for his role in the murder and was eventually released on parole in 1997. He died on September 3, 2011, of a drug overdose in the bathroom of a Cambridge, Massachusetts homeless shelter. Black community leaders and residents in Boston were outraged at the treatment that black men and boys had received at the hands of police, the blank check, if you will, to terrorize the city in pursuit of this phantom suspect. Immediately, there was a lot of backpedaling by police, both sidesism from prosecutors, what were the police supposed to do, justifications from certain residents of the city and media, weak tea apologies from the mayor. In fact, when the mayor visited William Bennett's family in a so-called act of contrition, he only stayed for a few minutes, would not take a seat when offered, and called the whole thing, quote, very unfortunate. I mean, a bad dye job is unfortunate, or when you mess up your nails before they dry, that's unfortunate. Not what happened with William Bennett. That goes beyond very unfortunate. No one wanted to own up to the fact that they had scorched the city for a boogeyman on the word of one man, specifically a white man. William Bennett later sued the police, and the FBI opened an investigation into how police had handled this case. In the meantime, Boston was about to blow, as in burn this mother down blow, as in Watts riots, Rodney King level riots. There was nothing that any of the officials could say that would bring the temperature down. It wasn't until the DeMady family, in partnership with community leaders in Mission Hill, stepped in, did the tensions begin to ease. They held a community vigil, a rally, and a concert to promote healing. In addition, in Carol's memory, the DeMady family established the Carol Stuart Foundation, which provides scholarships to Mission Hill residents and graduates of Malden High School. Marvin Geller, the attorney for the DeMady family, said, "Carol would not want to be remembered as the victim of a sensational murder, but rather as a woman who left behind a legacy of healing and compassion." Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and you can show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. And while you're there, you can find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus episodes and other fun stuff. And you can learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.